Let's do it. Day 2. Hello friends, and welcome to day 2 of what I'm calling the Drenched in Wonder Cannabis Conversations. Obviously, I'm talking into a camera here. I don't have another person to converse with here right this moment. Maybe I will at some future point, but I'm still calling it Cannabis Conversations because I believe this is a conversation, obviously, and it's a conversation that you're involved with as well, and a really important one, needless to say. So I really encourage you, be part of this conversation. And that is quite a perfect segue into today's topic, which is stigma and stereotypes with cannabis. Something that I wanted to talk about really early on the adventure because it is just such an important topic to dive into, as we'll see. Now, before we dive in, I want you to just notice what comes up for you when we talk about cannabis, when we talk about the cannabis user, the stereotypical cannabis user. What comes up for you when you see the iconic cannabis leaf? What comes up for you when we hear terms like marijuana, when we hear terms like pot and stoner and weed and 420 and all of these different terms and symbols that are used around cannabis? Once upon a time, as you may know, I was very much a victim of the stigma myself. I was very much against cannabis, and I very much believed that anyone who did use it was a certain type of person. They were likely a lazy stoner type, or they were off tripping in a field somewhere, and that's what I believed. Like, where did this even come from? Why did I think that cannabis users lacked ambition or creativity or responsibility? Why did I assume that cannabis users were probably criminals, probably out there behaving badly, or perhaps not behaving at all, just kind of locked away, chilling on their couch? And then, of course, one day I tried it and I found it was basically the opposite of that effect for me. I had never had more energy, more creativity, more motivation to kind of get out there and do things in this world. And I'd never felt more responsible as a human. I suddenly saw the entirety of our human species as something really, really special, and to be treated with an incredible amount of respect and an incredible amount of care. And suddenly I was a kinder person as a result. I was a better person. I was a more creative person, a more productive person, and a more motivated person. And so the stigma for me was just happily shattered. But then, of course, I realized that in the minds of so many people, the stigma is still very, very much there, and it still exists very prominently in our society and in our culture. Where did it even come from? What began this? Cannabis has been around for a very, very long time. And for a very, very long time, it was used as a medicine. There was a time pre-cannabis prohibition where doctors would carry around cannabis in their toolkit to use as medicine. And then something happened. And then it became this outlawed thing. It became this prohibited substance. It's not the story for today, but if you feel so inclined, I encourage you to dive deeper into the story of cannabis prohibition and demonization, which all kind of began in the 20s and 30s. And as we see now, very much based on racial prejudice and bias and discrimination. Google the story, it's worth a look. Getting back to the stigma and the stereotypes. Why is this harmful? Because it stops the conversation before it starts. It discourages responsible, informed use, and it prevents people from discovering something that could be truly transformative in their lives. It contributes to shame and fear and just all of it. And ultimately, it's the number one reason why I'm choosing to share my story about cannabis, because the stigma has got to go. When we start diving into it, we see that cannabis users are from all walks of life. They are artists, they are entrepreneurs, they are parents, they are professionals, and they're all ages, or rather, they're adults of all ages. We'll come back to that. And of course, not everyone necessarily uses cannabis to get high. There are so many ways that it can be used and so many ways that it can add benefit to our lives. However, as I've mentioned, I am primarily focused on the use of cannabis as a psychological stimulant, so I'll stick with that. One example that I want to share with you of a documented cannabis user, one of my personal heroes, Carl Sagan, the astronomer and astrophysicist. When I learned that Carl Sagan, of all people, was a cannabis user and that he used it to find insight and inspiration and creativity, I was like, what? Carl Sagan? Are you kidding me? This legend of humanity. Look him up if you haven't heard of him. But yes, Carl Sagan, a documented cannabis user, he wrote an essay in 1969 under the pseudonym Mr. X. And he himself, he did this because he was concerned about the stigma. But he writes about how he uses it in his daily life, how he uses it to find meaning, how he uses it to enhance his life and enhance his perception. I'll link to it below, check it out, worth a look. But this really opened my eyes. Carl Sagan, like the literal opposite of this stereotype, a documented cannabis user. And of course, there are so many more. But we think about like how cannabis shows up in culture, in media, in the TV shows and the movies that we watch. You know, very often it has been as a stereotype. And it's funny and it's entertaining, but is it accurate? Is this how cannabis users are now being seen? Is this actually contributing to the stigma? And it's why I believe that telling our cannabis stories is so important, and coming out as cannabis users, as hard as that is incredibly important as well. And people are scared to own the fact that they are a cannabis user. And I am the same. Like, it took me a long time to build up the courage to tell anybody that I was a cannabis user, let alone come out as a cannabis user, let alone write a book about it. And we see this, how the stigma is holding us back. I had a conversation with a politician here in Australia who's campaigning for legalization. And he told me about how he's spoken with so many people who want this change, but people are scared to put their name on a petition that will be presented in Parliament because they are worried about the stigma. They are worried about being discriminated against in their workplace, in their lives, in their families. And it's understandable. No one wants to be tarred with that brush. Even now, even me having this conversation right now, I have a suspicion that I'm missing out on professional opportunities that I would have otherwise had because people now see me as the cannabis guy or the stoner guy. You know, it's a real thing. I feel like we need to shift this conversation. I feel like the cannabis users of this world need to come out. And it's easier said than done. I get that. But there's actually never been a better time. The cannabis community, as I'm learning more and more, are made up of just so many beautiful, tremendous, wonderful people, which doesn't surprise me at all. But even just having conversations about cannabis, about our experiences with cannabis, and I realize not all of them are good experiences, you know. Cannabis is something to be treated with an endless amount of respect and care, but we need to change the conversation around it. We need to rid ourselves of this stigma that has been with us for far too long. What about you? What stigmas do you hold? What have you been taught? What's your gut feeling when you see the cannabis leaf? Or when you hear that someone is a cannabis user? Are you worried that people will make assumptions about you if you come out as a cannabis user? Comment below, tell me your experience. One last thing, folks. I think something that we can all do is to think about the picture of who the responsible cannabis user actually is. Maybe it is the lazy stoner, but also maybe it is the grandmother getting off the bus. Maybe it is the professional getting into the elevator. Maybe it's the actor in the TV show that you're hooked on. It probably is. Maybe it's the writer of that show. Would that show exist without cannabis? I don't know. Maybe. Thank you so much for joining me, folks. Comment below, tell me your experience, and I'll look forward to sharing day 3 with you, where I'm going to talk a little bit more about my story and how cannabis works for me specifically. Keep having conversations, folks. Be safe, be smart. I'll see you soon.